If you were to ask a collection of people from all across the world to name as many US states as possible, they will probably start off with California, New York, Florida, maybe Pennsylvania, but one state that almost everyone recognizes is the state of Texas. The Lone Star State is one of the most influential and prominent in the country, with its effect being felt in every aspect such as culture, economics, politics, and many other factors. Simply looking at the statistics, this concept becomes easier to see. Texas is the second most populous state in the US, holding over 30 million citizens. In terms of land, it is also the second largest as well, spanning over 268,596 square miles. Texas also produces 40% of the whole country's oil supply, accounts for 10% of total manufacturing in America, and also is the #1 producer of wind power in the nation. In fact, if Texas were an independent country, it would have the 10th highest GDP on Earth, with a higher GDP than massive nations like Canada, Australia, and Mexico. The latter fact is particularly interesting because Texas actually used to be a sovereign nation at one point. Interestingly enough, Texas's path to American statehood is a journey filled with rich history that saw the territory switch nationality a grand total of 6 times over the course of just 4 decades. The independent Republic of Texas existed from 1836 to 1846, and the influence of this era can still be felt today among the Texan population, who have a culture based on self-sufficiency and self-preservation. And curiously, one indicator of the state's autonomous past can be seen in the remnants of several Texan embassies found across the world. You see, in order to build more international support and recognition, the new nation constructed 3 embassies and legations, with one in Washington, D.C., another in Paris, and the most prominent being the London Embassy. Today, we discover the story of the Texan embassies and what remains of them today. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. The first European shoes to step on the sands of Texas were the Spanish conquistadors in 1528. Prior to this exploration, the land was sparsely populated by a few Native American tribes, most notably the Caddo Indians. The name of Texas actually comes from the Caddo word that means friend or ally. Over the next 2 centuries, the Spanish began sending more expeditions to the region, with the first settlement, a town called San Antonio, being founded in 1718. Under the viceroyalty of New Spain, Texas was part of a Spanish territory that included several modern nations such as Mexico, Cuba, Panama, Venezuela, and the Philippines, as well as many future U.S. states like Florida, California, and Nevada. In Texas, the Spanish constructed many buildings, mostly churches, chapels, missions, military forts, and small towns, and their motivation was to spread Catholicism and secure Spanish control over the region. Many of these structures still stand today. For most of its history, Spanish Texas was not densely populated, but that changed at the turn of the 19th century after the United States of America won independence from Great Britain and expanded their borders with the Louisiana Purchase. With Louisiana now an American territory, the U.S. and Texas shared a direct border, and many Americans immigrated to Texas. This continued over the years, with the government in Mexico City even encouraging American immigration. And this all led to the creation of a distinct Texan culture that still survives today, as the Spanish population, who were becoming more independent, blended together with the immigrants from the American South as well as the pre-existing Native Americans. In the early 1800s, the steep decline of the Spanish Empire and the devastating aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars invigorated independence movements across the Americas. all of whom had been developing their own culture and peoples over the past century. And it's important to note they were also inspired by the US's independence from Britain. Mexico was one of these territories, and in 1821, Mexico concluded their decade-long conflict, defeating Spain and solidifying their status as a sovereign nation. Texas was now a province of the new nation of Mexico. Unfortunately for Mexico, independence brought upon more chaos and instability due to the repercussions of war. Over time, the people of Texas, who had already learned to be self-sufficient and who had just fought off the Spanish Empire, started to become disillusioned with the central government in Mexico City, which they began to view as both incompetent and tyrannical. After a few years of growing conflict, Texas founded their own provisional government and declared independence in 1836. Led by Texan heroes such as Sam Houston, Stephen Austin, Jim Bowie, William Travis, Davy Crockett, and many others, the Texans forged their sovereignty through a bloody war with Mexico. This conflict is perhaps best known for two incidences: the Battle of the Alamo and the Battle of San Jacinto. At the Battle of the Alamo, the Texan Volunteer Army was able to drive the Mexican forces out of San Antonio. This prompted Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, the famous Mexican dictator, to lead his army to San Antonio to quell the rebellion and punish the revolutionaries. The Texan army did not have enough troops to hold the city, so they mostly retreated, except for a small band of soldiers who chose to stay and fortify the Alamo, a small fort and mission on the outskirts of the city. Despite being heavily outnumbered and outgunned, the Texans held out for 13 days and inflicted heavy casualties on Santa Anna's army. And although the Alamo would eventually fall, the valiant display of courage sparked the fire of revolt in Texas. After the Alamo, Santa Anna chased Sam Houston, the provisional commander-in-chief of Texas, trying to bring a swift end to the rebellion with his capture. And knowing that the Mexican leader was desperate to catch him, Houston lured Santa Anna into a trap by leading his army into an open field by the river. The Battle of San Jacinto started when Houston's men ambushed the resting Mexican army, and it was over in under 20 minutes. Despite having the strength in numbers, Mexico was dealt a humiliating defeat, with Santa Anna himself being captured and forced to sign a peace treaty. While the Mexican government still wouldn't recognize the new sovereign state, Texas had fought and won their independence. Though Texas had secured their freedom, it was not smooth sailing afterwards. The young country was hit with economic strife, difficulty safeguarding their border, and, most of all, they feared Mexico would invade again. After years of desperate negotiations, Texas would find their savior in the United States, as the U.S. vowed to annex Texas in 1845. Following a decade of complete independence, Texas would become an American territory and then eventually a state, with the time in between being when their embassies would arise. In order to deter Mexican invasion, Texas tried to legitimize their sovereignty by forming relationships with other powerful nations in the world, and they did this by building several embassies in those countries. In total, Texas built 3 embassies, one in the US, which was one of the few nations to recognize Texan independence, another in France, and one in the UK, which is the most famous. Technically, these structures were not embassies, but rather legations, meaning it was run by a lower-level government official rather than an ambassador. And it's here we have to make a note. You see, legations often perform many of the same functions as an embassy would, hence most people refer to them as embassies anyway. Let's start off with the Texan Embassy in Britain, which was located at 4 James Street in central London. The embassy was located inside a small stone building that surprisingly has been the site of numerous unconnected historic events since the time of its construction in 1730. For example, this tiny building used to hold a prominent yet suspicious gambling den, and the courtyard bore witness to London's last ever official duel. Napoleon III even briefly stayed here after his exile from France. Today, the small stone building at 4 James Street is a wine shop run by Berry Brothers and Rudd, a renowned firm that has operated in this building for nearly 300 years. And well, obviously, the building is no longer a Texan embassy. The history of the era is well remembered. In 1836, after Texas declared independence and began constructing international embassies, the Texas government was looking across the world for places to establish diplomatic relations. In England, they chose the building at 4 James Street, and the Berry Brothers Company leased the upper floors to their eventual Texan residents. International relations were formalized when the then Texan president Sam Houston sent his Secretary of State Dr. Ashbel Smith to England to meet with British government officials. In the 10-year span of Texan nationhood, they had a very interesting relationship with Great Britain. They tried to play all sides in the conflict between Texas and Mexico, with Britain going back and forth between supporting Texan independence and encouraging them to rejoin Mexico before trying to deter U.S. annexation. By 1845, however, the Republic of Texas voted to be annexed by the U.S., but much to the dismay of Britain, who at that point had intended to become strong allies with Texas for economic and geopolitical reasons. Once Texas became American, the Texan delegation left 4 James Street, and interestingly enough, they did not pay their rent, worth $160. Surprisingly, this debt was settled in 1986, though, when the Anglo-Texan Society visited the wine shop and finally paid the rent they owed in celebration of the 150th anniversary of Texan independence. As was said before, the wine shop is still in operation today, but all that remains of the Texan Embassy is a plaque that reads, quote, "Texas Legation in this building was the legation for the ministers from the Republic of Texas to the Court of St. James, 1842 to 1845. The Berry Brothers wine merchant firm who leased the property for the Texas Legation also have a long history connected to British foreign relations. The origin of the Berry Brothers states that a widow named Miss Bourne started a grocery store in the St. James district, right next to the St. James Palace. Then, in 1698, the St. James Palace became the home of the British monarch. Still to this day, ambassadors to the UK are referred to as being in the court of St. James. Miss Bourne's daughter Elizabeth married a man named William Pickering, who started a series of coffee shops. Then, in 1760, these shops supplied the royal family, though by 1810, the grocery store was renamed after George Berry and his 2 sons, who took control of the business and transitioned towards selling wine and liquor. Given that the Berry Brothers were no strangers to political guests, by the 1830s, the Berry Brothers were happy to lease the upper floors of their shop to the Texan Legation. And given that some of the recent tenants in the shop were gambling dens, brothels, and other operations that had connections to organized crime, the Berry Brothers were especially delighted with their new change in clientele. After the Texan delegation left following U.S. annexation, the Berry Brothers paid tribute to their former tenants by creating a new brand of whiskey titled the Texan Legation Bourbon Whiskey. Compared to the Texan Embassy in London, not much is known about the other 2 in Washington, D.C. and Paris. Given that the U.S. officially recognized Texas as an independent nation in 1836, as well as the long cultural ties between the 2 countries, it naturally makes sense that Texas established an embassy in Washington, D.C. in order to open diplomatic relations. The location of the embassy changed on several occasions. Some of the spots included a boarding house on Pennsylvania Avenue, the U.S. Naval Memorial, and an office building. On unfortunately, because the embassy changed locations so many times, there isn't much left to commemorate the former embassy ever since Texas was annexed. Well, it was in operation though. US and Texan diplomats discussed many important issues such as a possible war with Mexico, the plans for Texan annexation, border disputes, immigration, and even slavery, as some pro-slavery politicians wanted to incorporate Texas into the Union as a slave state. In September of 1839, France partially recognized Texas alongside several other European nations, such as Belgium and the Netherlands, and hence France opened a legation of their own in Austin, down the street from the Texas Capitol building, with Texas opening a legation in Paris in a building near the Tuileries Palace. Over the years, however, the building has been restored and rebuilt so many times that it looks completely different from when it hosted the Texan legation. Currently, it is now a mansion called the Hotel de Vendôme. On one of the walls, there is a plaque that commemorates the site of the former Texan legation. And before moving forward, we have to pause for a second and really consider how important these establishments were. You see, the existence of a Texan embassy in London signified a much larger political connection between the Republic of Texas and Great Britain. At that time, Great Britain was the undisputed global power in an era known as Pax Britannica, due to their victory in the Napoleonic Wars as well as their expansive navy. The British Empire was essentially the world's police, and as a result, they played a role in almost every major geopolitical issue. This situation is actually very similar to the USA's role in current geopolitics, and just like today, detractors of Great Britain would say their primary motivation was the consolidation of power or greed for resources, while supporters would say they looked to uphold global moral values while spreading liberty and civilization. Both sides of the argument had valid claims, as Great Britain was criticized for committing atrocities like the Boer concentration camps in South Africa or causing the Irish potato famine, but at the same time they did great things like outlaw slavery throughout their entire empire while also promoting free trade across the world. We can see this dichotomy in Britain's relationship with Texas, as they officially claim to be acting simply as mediators of peace between Texas and Mexico, with the further goal of ending slavery, while cynics would say Britain was only interested in getting the valuable cotton from Texas, while also curtailing the growing power of both Mexico and US on a geopolitical scale. During the early 1840s, Mexico was gearing up for another invasion to retake Texas, and it seemed as if war was imminent. President Santa Anna sent a proposal to President Houston offering Texas more autonomy if they rejoined Mexico. However, Santa Anna secretly said to his cabinet that should Houston refuse, he will invade and take the land by force. At first, the British urged Houston to at least entertain the idea of coming to the negotiation table to avoid a war. Houston initially objected, knowing that he would never surrender Texan sovereignty back to Mexico. The very concept of negotiating with Mexico was actually against the wishes of the Texan population. The people desperately wanted to fight and avenge the atrocities committed by Santa Anna and his forces less than 10 years ago. The Texan population also were mostly descendants of soldiers, frontiersmen, and hunters, meaning that they were used to enduring hardship and were willing to resume the conflict. Soon it became evident that Santa Anna's compromise was actually a farce from the start, meant only to stall time so he could organize his army. As a result, each side prepared for war. Britain then capitalized on the situation, knowing Texas would never willingly rejoin Mexico. They moved toward supporting an independent Texan state so they could limit American Western expansion, profit off Texan cotton, and abolish slavery in the region. Some even pondered turning Texas into a British colony. President Houston knew his country was in desperate need of help, which is why he tried to establish close ties with the US at first, but Congress originally decided against annexation because of the instability on Texas borders. This forced Texas into Britain's arms. The quickly developing Texan-British Union capped off with the creation of the Texas Embassy in London and served as a wake-up call to the US, as naturally, only a few decades after the War of 1812, Britain was still seen as the eternal rival of the USA. Basically, a British ally, or worse, a large British colony on their southern border would be detrimental for economic, military, cultural, and geopolitical reasons. So in 1843, US President John Tyler, who had low approval ratings at the time and needed something to boost his public image, sent the Secretary of State, Abel P. Upshur, to meet with Isaac Van Zandt, the de facto Texas ambassador in Washington, D.C., to begin the talks of annexation. Congress then voted to annex Texas in 1845, and by the next year, it was officially American territory. Almost immediately after the American annexation of Texas, the Mexican-American War broke out, with the status of the Lone Star State being one of the motivating factors behind the conflict. In fact, the war broke out over a disagreement over where Texas's border ends. Mexico claimed the border ended at the Nueces River, while the U.S. stated it was at the Rio Grande. After Mexico refused to negotiate, U.S. President James K. Polk ordered U.S. troops to occupy the disputed area, and once Mexican troops opened fire, war was underway. While there was some controversy over where the U.S. troops had been located at the time of the attack, President Polk mobilized the country for war and prepared an invasion of Mexico. The American invasion of Mexico was split into three prongs. Colonel Stephen Kearny easily took the territories of New Mexico and California, who, like Texas, had grown disillusioned with the centralized Mexican government and preferred U.S. rule. The second campaign saw General Zachary Taylor cross the Rio Grande from Texas and take Monterrey, while also winning the pivotal battle at Buena Vista. The third and final campaign involved General Winfield Scott's amphibious assault on Veracruz before marching onwards and capturing Mexico City, ending the war with a resounding U.S. victory. From there, the U.S. and Mexico signed a treaty ending all hostilities. Interestingly, though the U.S. had the ability to annex all of Mexico, they settled for just the northwestern territories, which included land such as Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and California, with the U.S. paying Mexico $15 million. As for Texas, Mexico officially relinquished all claims to the territory. The legacy of Texas's sovereign past has naturally lived on despite Texas becoming an American state. The people have an ingrained inclination to self-sufficiency and self-governance, and they don't take kindly to those who try to strip them of those rights. Unfortunately, this quality was exploited during the Civil War as Texas joined the Confederacy, attempting to split from the U.S. Texas's entry into the Confederacy was extremely controversial within the state. Some Texans were slave owners and wanted to continue the practice, while others disagreed with the notion of slavery altogether. Sam Houston, who ultimately became the governor of Texas, refused to pledge allegiance to the Confederacy and was removed from power once Texas formally seceded from the Union. The idea of rebellion was inevitably enticing to many Texans who feared the centralized American government could become tyrannical, just like Mexico and Spain had before. But after the Civil War ended in defeat for the rebels, Texas was formally reincorporated into the Union by 1870. Afterwards, Texas was able to use their vast supply of natural resources as the Industrial Revolution hit the U.S. and industry boomed, in many ways transforming the Lone Star State into what we know today. Even in the current day, the echoes of nationhood remain. As the political climate in the U.S. becomes more and more volatile every year, a small movement has arisen in Texas called Texit, named after Brexit, England's vote to leave the European Union in 2016. Texit supporters feel particularly motivated to achieve even more decentralization and self-governance, in fact, of the perceived bloated and incompetent central government, with with some simply looking to propose legislation that gives Texas more autonomy or the ability to leave the U.S., while others endorse a complete secession from the United States. But it should be strongly emphasized here that this is not a mainstream opinion in Texan politics, but it certainly serves as a reminder of Texan sovereignty as well as their desire to govern themselves. So when looking at the great state of Texas today, it may be a little jarring at first to think that it was once an independent nation, but a deeper look into Texan culture can reveal a lot about its history and the freedom and self-sufficiency that they had to fight so hard for. Beyond the intangible indicators, there does exist some material proof of the independent Texan Republic, some of which being the 3 embassies across the world. And well, all that is left of the Texan Embassy in London is a plaque on a wall in a wine shop. It still acts as a window into a time when the world looked very different than it does now. And on a final note, I know that we have a lot of viewers from the East Coast, but I'm curious if we have anyone watching from Texas. So Texans, make yourself known by hitting that subscribe button and stay tuned for new videos every Thursday and Saturday. Until then, I'm Ryan Socash signing off.